welcome back to The View. A few weeks ago, we did a deep dive into the first set of allegations against Michael Jackson, which were leveled by the Chandler family in the early 90s. For those of you who missed that episode and are interested in finding out more about that case, we'll endeavor to leave a link in the description box below. In this week's episode, we turn our attention to the 2005 criminal case in which Michael Jackson was accused by a boy called Gavin Arvizo of sexually molesting him at Neverland Ranch. Charles Thomson is with me again and raring to go. Over the next hour or so, I'll ask Charles to examine the origins of the allegations, the evidence presented by both sides, the key moments from the trial, and the reasons why the jury reached the verdict that it did. We'll also spend some time discussing the continuing debate surrounding the case, including the recent Netflix documentary that has revisited the allegations and introduced a version of the story to a new generation of viewers. Hi, Charles. How are you?
Yeah, I'm okay, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm good, Charles. So how should we do this? I guess let's pick up where we left off a couple of weeks ago. Can you tell us a little bit about Michael Jackson's career after he settled the civil suit with the Chandler family? How much did the allegations damage him, do you think?
Well, they didn't have a huge impact on his marketability. So he followed those allegations with an album called History, which was a greatest hits set with a disc of new music attached to it. And that became the biggest selling double album in history. Then he released an EP called Blood on the Dance Floor with a bunch of remixes on it. That became the biggest selling remix album in history. But then he kind of disappeared into the wilderness, and what happened was he kind of retreated back into drug addiction. So he performed a concert, a charity concert, where he was performing on a bridge which was supposed to come apart and then lower him down to the stage. And the equipment failed and the bridge collapsed and he badly injured himself and ended up dependent on painkillers. And so by the time he reemerged in 2001 with his next album, Invincible, that was a different story because he really did look like a completely different person. He looked terrible. The album was not very good. He didn't really market it effectively because he was not capable of doing so. So Invincible was the first kind of flop of his adult solo career, although I use the word flop within the context of Michael Jackson. So a Michael Jackson flop is anybody else's hit. I think the album sold about 10 million copies. If you or I sold 10 million copies of an album, Rolling Stone will be putting us on the cover as the greatest thing since sliced bread. But for Michael Jackson, selling only 10 million copies of an album was a bit of a disaster. So he then fell out with his record label, Sony, because he accused them of under-promoting the album and of effectively sabotaging him. He believed that they were trying to deliberately constrict his earnings because they were involved in a separate business arrangement with him concerning the ownership of music. And if he became financially strapped, then they could effectively try to take his part of their other business from him. So that was his belief. He went on a big campaign against Sony, and the media was not having it. The media, of course, hated Michael Jackson and sided very much with Sony. And it was in the midst of that maelstrom that he was approached by a British journalist called Martin Bashir, who said, I want to make a documentary about you, about who you are as a person, and particularly about your humanitarian and philanthropic work. And Michael Jackson saw it as a way to try to improve his public image. And so that became the beginning of the next chapter of the kind of ruination of Michael Jackson.
What can you tell us about Martin Bashir?
So Martin Bashir was a journalist with the BBC initially here he started in the local media and then he became a BBC reporter. He worked for the BBC's flagship current affairs show, which was called Panorama. Panorama was a program which would do undercover investigations and exposes, would expose arms dealers or so on and so forth. And while he was working for Panorama, he landed an enormous scoop, which was a devastating interview with Princess Diana, where she essentially accused Prince Charles of having an affair while they were married, said there were 3 of them in the marriage, and was very critical of him and of the royal family more generally. It was an interview which did not do her many favors here in the UK. And subsequently, it has emerged that the way that Martin Bashir obtained that interview was extraordinarily unethical. So what he had done was to try to curry favor with Princess Diana. He had a colleague, a graphic designer, fake bank statements. They created fake bank statements, and he presented these fake bank statements and said, I can prove that members of your staff are selling stories about you to the media, but I can help you. I can help you fight fire with fire. I can help you get your side of the story out. And it turned out the whole thing was fake. There were no bank statements. There were no stories sold to the media. So anyway, that was who Martin Bashir was. He had a checkered history as a journalist anyway. He'd been involved in other cases where he'd been the subject of complaints. There's one particularly famous murder case here in the UK, the Babes in the Wood murder case, where he took evidence from one of the families. He took clothing that was worn by one of the murdered children and claimed he was going to get it DNA tested, and then apparently lost it. And so potentially vital evidence was lost by Martin Bashir, according to the family. I mean, he contests a lot of this, but the evidence is quite strong. So that's who Martin Bashir was. He was, at that time, a well-known and fairly well-respected journalist in the UK, but subsequently his career has ended and his reputation has been absolutely decimated.
So that documentary comes out, I guess, in February 2003. I remember it coming out, actually. I remember watching it at the time. I was 14 years old. And it caused a great furore from what I remember. Can you just tell me about your memories about the way it was received? Or rather, yeah, maybe a better way of asking that question is, what are the salient parts of the documentary?
So the part that caused all the controversy was that there was a child in the documentary, a boy called Gavin Arvizo, who was a former cancer patient. So he had been sick with cancer. He contacted Michael Jackson, developed a friendship with him, been invited out to the ranch. Michael had undergone a number of philanthropic activities, such as organizing blood drives to try to help him battle the cancer. And because Bashir had told Michael Jackson that this documentary was going to focus on his philanthropic work, Michael had arranged for a number of people to speak to Bashir, or he'd asked a number of people to speak to Bashir. One of them was a burns victim called Dave, who originally called Dave Rothenberg, who had been set on fire by his father and been covered head to toe in burns. And Michael had befriended him and paid for all his treatment, and even into adulthood had paid a lot of Dave's living expenses because life was very difficult for him. So he arranged for Dave to come down to the ranch and speak to Bashir. And he also arranged for Gavin Arvizo and his family to come and speak to Bashir about the support that he'd given them during Gavin's cancer. But in the documentary, they're sat together on a couch in Michael Jackson's kind of kitchen diner area, and Gavin Arvizo is holding Michael Jackson's hand and rests his head on Michael Jackson's shoulder, and they're talking about their friendship and how it came about and how it kind of evolved. And there's a moment where it is revealed that Gavin had sleepovers with Michael Jackson. He'd spent time in Michael Jackson's bedroom, and there's a whole story that is told about Michael told me that I should sleep in the bed and he would sleep on the floor, and I said, no, you sleep in the bed and I'll sleep on the floor. And in the end, Michael told me, if you love me, you'll sleep in the bed. So I slept in the bed and Michael slept on the floor. Now, the way this was presented by the media the next day, so practically every front page in the UK was running a story about this documentary, and it was, quotes, if you love me, you'll sleep in my bed. So it was basically the context was removed from the actual detail of what had been described, and it was presented wholesale by the media as an admission that Michael Jackson was sharing a bed with a child, which it was not. However, what then happens is in the final scene of the documentary, there's a kind of a showdown in Florida where Bashir starts to quite aggressively question Michael Jackson about various issues, including his plastic surgery, who is he the biological father of his children, and then about Gavin. And he's talking to Michael about the whole issue of Gavin and Michael sleeping in the same room, and Michael says, I slept on the floor, and Bashir says, so you never slept in a bed with Gavin? And Michael says, no. And then there's a pause, and then he says, but I have slept in a bed with many children, which is, I mean, why? But so this creates a firestorm. In the aftermath of this documentary airing, people like Gloria Allred are all over the TV saying Michael Jackson must be investigated. The Department for Children and Family Services in Los Angeles launches an investigation into the nature of Michael Jackson's relationship with Gavin Arvizo. So it was a terrible PR disaster for Michael Jackson.
Yes, that's pretty much consistent with my own recollection of the sort of fallout from that documentary. It's all anyone really wanted to talk about. Michael Jackson's relationship with children. Was it inappropriate? Allusions were made, of course, to the 1993 episode with the Chandler family, which we discussed in a previous video. So yes, I remember that being, an extremely controversial part of the film. It was actually the only part of the film that anyone really wanted to talk about. It was the only part of the film that got any real media coverage. Now, who were the Arvizo family?
Well,
how did Michael Jackson come across them?
Yeah, so there's the story that Michael Jackson knew when he met them, and then there's the story that emerges after the whole situation explodes. So the Arvizo family, as far as Michael Jackson knew at the time that he took them in, they were an impoverished family from East LA who lived in a one-room apartment where they all slept on one mattress. The boy had cancer. They were struggling to pay for the treatment, and his dying wish, he was on the verge of death, and his dying wish was that he wanted to meet his hero, Michael Jackson. So Michael Jackson's long-term hairdresser, Carol Lemire, had a grandson called Quay, who was in the same tap dancing class as the Arvizos. And so through Carol Lemire, the Arvizo family end up getting their wish. They end up being introduced to and meeting Michael Jackson. Initially, it's over the phone because Gavin is in the hospital, so Michael starts ringing him on the phone and talking to him. He sends him stuff in the hospital, like computer game consoles and things like that, to pass the time. And then when Gavin was well enough, the family went out to the ranch, and they made a number of visits to the ranch over a fairly long period. And then they disappeared from Michael Jackson's life, which the story as to how that happened would emerge later after the allegations come about. And he really loses contact with them, and they're gone. They are gone from his life until Martin Bashir says, I want to make a documentary about your philanthropic work. And Michael thinks, well, who can I introduce him to? And he comes up with two names, Dave Rothenberg and Gavin Arvizo. And so Michael finds Gavin Arvizo and his family, reestablishes contact with them, and invites them out to the ranch and introduces them to Martin Bashir.
Do we know how many years passed? How many years they were out of contact before the Martin Bashir documentary becomes a pretext or a reason for them to reconnect?
It's about a year. So,
okay.
And we know that because after they were kind of ousted, after they lost contact, they bombarded him with cards and letters. So they were just constantly writing to him saying, we miss you, we love you, you're our father, your children are our siblings, we miss our brother and sister, Prince and Paris, we'd love to come and visit you again, where are you, you know. So they're just letter after letter and card after card. So it was about a year that they were out of contact, roughly, you know, give or take a few months.
Okay. You began by saying that there was the version of events or that Michael Jackson knew about, or his understanding of the family and the reality. What was the reality? You've told us about what Michael Jackson's understanding was about this family. What was the reality? How was it different?
So the reality was that they were essentially a family of grifters who had gone after a number of organizations and individuals in an attempt to extract money from them. So they had they were a family of shoplifters, and they were once caught shoplifting from a J.C. Penney store. And when they were ejected from the store and arrested, the mother made a claim that the J.C. Penney security guards had violently attacked them and filed a lawsuit. And then sometime into that lawsuit, suddenly added a new element of the case and said that they'd sexually abused her as well. She ended up receiving a very large settlement in that case of over $100,000. Despite receiving that settlement, she covered it up and continued to claim welfare. So she was defrauding the US government out of welfare, for which she was later, after Michael Jackson's trial, convicted. She was criminally convicted for that.
This is the mother of Gavin Arvizo.
This is the mother of Gavin Arvizo. Her name is Janet Arvizo. They had also targeted a string of celebrities and organizations. So they were claiming to people that they couldn't afford the bills for Gavin's chemotherapy. In fact, there were no bills because the father was a member of the Teamster Union and they had insurance through that. So the medical bills were all being paid through the insurance. However, there were comedy clubs that were organizing fundraisers to pay for the non-existent medical bills. They went to their local newspaper and they had a story run in the paper saying, we can't afford the chemotherapy bills. Can you run a fundraiser for us? The newspaper raised a bunch of money, and then the Arvizos came back and said, you haven't raised enough, you need to do it again. The editor became suspicious, investigated, and discovered that there were no medical bills, that they were all being covered by insurance. There was a local weatherman who told the defense investigators the same thing had happened to him. He'd been asked for money towards the medical bills. Chris Tucker, the comedian, would later say that he had been asked for money towards the medical bills. There was a comedian called George Lopez who said that the Arvizos befriended him through one of the comedy clubs and were not backward in coming forward, if we can put it that way, about asking him for money and gifts. He was constantly spending money on them. And on one occasion, they came to his house. There was a room in his house that he told them they were not allowed to go into, and they went into it anyway. And after they left, he found a wallet in the room. Turned out to be Gavin Arvizo's wallet, and so he mailed it back to Gavin Arvizo because he didn't really want to see them again. And then he found out that they were going around telling people that there had been hundreds of dollars in the wallet, and that George Lopez had stolen Gavin Arvizo's money before he mailed it back to them. and that the comedy club that he met them through had believed the Arvizos and had actually reimbursed them for the money that George Lopez had supposedly stolen. So he was absolutely furious. There was a lady called Louise Palanca who had given them two $10,000 checks, so $20,000 in total. They were supposed to spend the bulk of that on creating a sterile room in their house for Gavin to be treated. She actually put them in touch with a contractor to do all the work. And when she met that contractor sometime later, he told them they stiffed her and never paid the bill. So she started wondering where her $20,000 had gone. And it turned out they spent quite a large amount of it on a top-of-the-line home cinema system. So there was just a string of people in the wake of the Arvizos who had been bilked or deceived into handing over cash for reasons which turned out to be dubious.
Okay. So can you just run us through the timeline, please? So how do we get to a place from the release of the Martin Bashir documentary to the point? How do we get from there to the point where Gavin Arvizo accuses Michael Jackson of molesting him?
So obviously the exact sequence of events is known only to the Arvizos, but when the documentary airs, the Arvizos are very much supporting Michael Jackson. They go to visit him in Miami, and then they're taken to Neverland, where they record a series of interviews saying that Michael has been nothing but generous and philanthropic towards them, and that nothing inappropriate has ever happened. Eventually, they leave Neverland. Concerns are growing about this family, particularly after a warning from Chris Tucker. And they are then cast out into the wilderness again. So after the whole hubbub about the Bashir documentary dies down, and having received the warning in particular from Chris Tucker about the family, they are iced out of Michael Jackson's world. However, at some point, the story changes, and the way it becomes a criminal investigation is that the family goes to see an attorney called Larry Feldman. Larry Feldman is the attorney who represented Jordy Chandler and his family in obtaining their settlement. They go to meet Larry Feldman and ask him about the possibility of suing Michael Jackson in a similar way for molestation. And under California's mandatory reporting rules, Larry Feldman telephones the police and says, I've just received a disclosure of alleged child sexual abuse by Michael Jackson. So it's a trip to Larry Feldman about the possibility of suing that triggers the police investigation.
That's not what the new Netflix documentary says, by the way. The
No,
new
it's
Netflix
not.
documentary, which is called The Verdict, says, okay, let me see if I remember this. Louise Palanca, who is a family friend, says that Janet Arvizo calls her up, asks for recommendations of lawyers. In fact, that she calls another mutual friend, asks for recommendations of a good lawyer. But that lawyer, who I guess you were saying is Larry Feldman, says these kids need to speak to a child psychologist. And it's the child psychologist, a guy called Stan Katz, who finds these boys credible and then informs the authorities. So that's what the Netflix documentary says.
That is what the Netflix documentary says. However, if you read the trial transcripts, it's a different story.
Okay. Sorry, who do you believe?
I'm inclined to believe the version in the trial transcript. So, because it's corroborated. So, Larry King, it never ended up coming before the jury. So the defense called two witnesses, Larry King and a friend of Larry King.
Larry King, the CNN television host?
Yes. So
Okay.
Larry King, when it became clear that that Michael Jackson was under criminal investigation, Larry King decided to start gearing up for how his TV show was going to cover the criminal case. So he asked for a meeting with Larry Feldman. They met at a deli in Los Angeles, and there was quite a few people at the meeting: Larry King, several of his associates, and Larry Feldman. And they wanted to ask Larry Feldman whether he would become a pundit for them, commentating on the case when it got to trial. And he told them at that meeting that he had met the mother. In his words, she was a wacko and she was just out for money. So he said, this woman came into my office wanting to sue Michael Jackson. She was a wacko and she's clearly just after money. And so not only Larry King testified to this, but one of Larry King's associates who was present at the meeting corroborated that entirely, and the exact same language. She's a wacko and she's out for money. So these two witnesses testified in front of Judge Melville, but in the absence of the jury. And Judge Melville then refused to allow them to testify in front of the jury, saying that their evidence was insufficiently important, basically. I think the defense wanted to call them as impeachment witnesses because Larry Feldman had testified earlier in the trial. So those two independent witnesses they corroborate the account that the mother went into the office of Larry Feldman and was looking to sue. And then there was another witness. Now, what was her name? Her name is not coming to my head right now, but she was the legal secretary to the law firm that represented the Arvizos in the J.C. Penney case, who testified about how Janet was just a crook and had actually admitted to her that the whole J.C. Penney case was fabricated to make money. And she testified that the last time she ever heard from Janet Arvizo was a few months before the trial began, when Janet Arvizo rang her out of the blue, seemingly for no reason, and just said, by the way, if you need to contact me in future, you'll have to go through my attorney. His name is Larry Feldman.
Okay. So because the timeline is really important here, let me just see if I have this right, and do correct me if I'm wrong. I just want to recap. So Michael Jackson introduces the Arvizo family to Martin Bashir. I guess that would have been in 2002 when the filming is happening for this documentary.
Yeah.
The documentary comes out. In that documentary, Gavin Arvizo is shown holding hands with Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson admits that he has slept in his bed with some children, though not Gavin Arvizo. The documentary comes out, I guess, February the 3rd, I think, 2003, if I'm not mistaken. And all anyone can talk about is Michael Jackson's inappropriate relationships with children, right? So this is front page news pretty much in every geography, particularly in the English-speaking world, in America and in the UK. And it is after that when all the world is talking about Michael Jackson's inappropriate relationships with children that Michael Jackson decides to molest Gavin Arvizo. Is this? Am I right here? Is this broadly speaking the timeline?
That is the timeline, yeah. So the timeline is Michael Jackson meets Gavin Arvizo circa 1999, is spending time with him for about a year on and off, with Gavin coming out to the ranch, never lays a finger on him, then doesn't speak to Gavin for about a year, invites him back to the ranch, again, never lays a finger on him during the whole Bashir filming, then loses touch with him again until the documentary comes out and the whole firestorm erupts. Gloria Allred goes on TV and says Michael Jackson must be investigated to see whether he's molesting Gavin Arvizo. The Los Angeles Department for Children and Family Services launches an investigation into whether Michael Jackson is molesting Gavin Arvizo, and Michael Jackson then goes, that sounds like a good idea. I think I'll start molesting Gavin Arvizo. That is the prosecution's timeline.
I mean, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, but I mean, okay, like, I mean, I don't want to editorialize, but I mean, does this not strike you as wildly implausible? I mean,
I think it
I mean,
struck a lot of people as wildly implausible. I mean, when Matt Taibbi was covering the case for Rolling Stone, he literally wrote the case is bullshit. He said that this timeline is absolutely nonsensical.
okay, right. Okay, I think I'd better move on before, you know. Okay. So let's talk about the charges then that Michael Jackson is booked for. Um, I think it was something like 4 counts of conducting or performing a lewd act on a minor, 4 counts of intoxicating a child with a view to carrying on, with a view to conducting said lewd acts. There were some other misdemeanor charges, and then there was a conspiracy charge, conspiracy involving child abduction, false imprisonment, and extortion. What does that mean exactly?
Okay, so the conspiracy charge is not there originally. This is a really important element of the case. So when I spoke to you last time and we were talking about why Michael Jackson settled and why it was a good decision to settle, and I said to
In the
you,
Chandler case.
in the Chandler case, about how if you have a civil and a criminal case going at the same time and you are forced to give away your defense, then the prosecution can tailor their case around your defense, right? So what happens in the Arvizo case is exactly that thing happens, except not through a civil case, but through illegal conduct by the officers. So in the few months between about, say, October of 2003, no, November 2003 and January 2004, the investigators in this case engage in a kind of a pattern of criminal conduct, illegal conduct. So the first thing they do when they raid Neverland, they exceed the terms of their own search warrant. So they enter parts of the property that are not covered by the warrant, and they take things that are not covered by the warrant. They then raid the office of Michael Jackson's defense private investigator. So when you hire a defense attorney, you obviously have attorney-client privilege. That attorney-client privilege necessarily extends to all contractors who are then hired by your attorney, because otherwise it would be a loophole for prosecutors and police that they can just go and, you know, raid the homes of everyone who works for your attorney, for example, and steal all their emails and stuff. So Michael Jackson hires a defense attorney. That defense attorney hires an investigator called Bradley Miller. The police raid the office of Bradley Miller and steal all of the defense material. They also raid the home of Michael Jackson's personal assistant, whose name is Evie Tabassi, and there are a stack of very clearly labeled defense documents which have the name of the defense attorney written on them, and they take those documents. So it's a series of illegal acts that the prosecution commits, which the judge ultimately says, oh, well, never mind, you can keep all the evidence. When they go through all of this evidence, they discover that Michael Jackson has quite a solid defense case. Firstly, he has an alibi for the dates of the supposed molestation. So when he's originally charged, the molestation is all said to have occurred between specific dates. It turns out Michael Jackson wasn't even in California on those dates. The Arvizos may well have been on the ranch, but Michael had gone back to Florida where he was house hunting. So Michael Jackson has an alibi. Also, they discover a tape recording of an interview between Bradley Miller and the Arvizos in which they are all denying that anything inappropriate has happened, and a videotaped interview by Michael's videographer, Christian Robinson, in which the Arvizos are all saying that nothing inappropriate happened to them. So the prosecutors are going, oh my God, our case is dead in the water. So what they do is they rearrange Michael Jackson. They change the dates on all the charges. So now they know when Michael Jackson's alibi is. They shift all the molestation backwards 2 weeks to a date when they know he doesn't have an alibi, and they recharge him under the new dates. What they also do is they add the conspiracy charge. So the conspiracy charge has a number of benefits to the prosecution. The first thing is, as part of this alleged conspiracy, they say that Michael Jackson forced the family to participate in these recordings where they're saying that nothing inappropriate happened. They say that he kidnapped this family, he held them against their will, and he forced them to make these recordings. The other benefits to them of a conspiracy charge are, firstly, if you charge somebody with conspiracy, you can turn a series of perfectly lawful acts into unlawful acts. So on the conspiracy charge, Michael is charged with something like 27 overt acts of conspiracy. And these overt acts of conspiracy include, for example, booking flights for the Arvizos to travel from Los Angeles to Florida. They include asking his ex-wife to participate in a documentary countering the Martin Bashir documentary and allegations. So you can actually send somebody to prison for engaging in perfectly lawful behavior if you list it as an overt act of conspiracy and a conspiracy charge. The next benefit is, in almost all criminal proceedings, third-party hearsay is not permitted. So witnesses cannot come into court and say, I heard this person say this to this person, or that person told me that that person said this. But when you add a conspiracy charge, third-party hearsay all becomes admissible. So it means that the Arvizos can come into court and basically say anything they want. They can say, yeah, Frank Cassio told me that Michael was conspiring to have us trafficked out of the country, or, Dieter and Ronald told us that there was a conspiracy to do this, and it all becomes admissible. And the final real benefit to the prosecution is they are able to effectively knock out all of Michael Jackson's most powerful defense witnesses by listing them as unindicted co-conspirators. So everybody that was directly involved in Michael Jackson's day-to-day running of his organization during the period after the Bashir documentary, when this is all supposed to have happened, everybody who is in the thick of it, dealing with the Arvizos and is able to testify about what the Arvizos were doing, what they were saying, where on the ranch they were, etc. They list all of these people as unindicted co-conspirators, which means we say you're part of the conspiracy, but we haven't charged you yet. Now, all of these people then have to go out and get lawyers. And when they go out and do that, any lawyer with any gumption at all is going to tell you, stay away from this case. Do not go anywhere near it. Don't testify as a defense witness, particularly, as I say, when you can go into court and testify to what you think are fairly benign pieces of information. Like, yeah, I asked somebody to participate in a documentary, and lo and behold, that's in the list of overt acts of conspiracy. Oh, so you did ask someone to participate in a documentary. You've committed a crime under this conspiracy. So you might say something that seems perfectly lawful and benign and end up implicating yourself in this stupid conspiracy charge. So the conspiracy charge is added at that point, and it's part of a whole new indictment, which is kind of reverse engineered to try to destroy Michael Jackson's defense based on a bunch of material that they gained access to through an unlawful search. Almost all of it came from the private investigator's office. So when the defense tried to get all this information thrown out, or certainly to raise complaints about the way in which it had been obtained, the prosecutors said, "Oh, we thought he was an investigator hired by Michael Jackson, not by the defense attorney." And the judge went, "Oh, well, if you did it by accident, then it's okay." In fact, that was not true anyway, because there was a tape recording from before the raid where Janet Arvizo explicitly described Bradley Miller to the prosecutors as being Mark Geragos's investigator, not Michael Jackson's investigator. But anyway, so I can't remember what. Oh, you asked me about the conspiracy charge. But anyway, that's the sequence of events that leads to the introduction of the conspiracy charge.
Yeah, and so Michael Jackson essentially is accused or indicted with one count of essentially imprisoning this family on Neverland Ranch. Now, it's been a fairly long time. It's been about 21 years. But I do remember that conspiracy charge sort of backfired in court, right? I mean, it became one of the primary reasons why the prosecution's case collapsed. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Well, yeah, because huge amounts of it were positively proven to be fictitious. So the family were claiming that they had been held prisoner at the ranch against their will. They were claiming that they had repeatedly escaped from the ranch and then been dragged back by Michael Jackson's henchmen. They were claiming that they weren't allowed to speak to outsiders. They were banned from using the phone. They couldn't go anywhere. They were claiming at one point even that the conspiracy was so elaborate that they wanted to completely disorient the family, and they wouldn't even allow them to see calendars or clocks because they wanted them to be so disoriented in time. I mean, just bizarre. So huge amounts of this are proved beyond any reasonable doubt to be just untrue. So during their supposed period of captivity, they leave the ranch repeatedly. Twice they go home and then come back. But also they go to a dentist appointment, they go to a hospital appointment, they go to a meeting with a lawyer because Janet is at that time planning or considering suing Martin Bashir for the inclusion of her kids in his show because she says she never signed a release form. So Janet goes for body waxes during this period. She and her children go out shopping for luggage and clothes for a trip to Brazil because part of the conspiracy charge was that Michael Jackson was supposedly planning to traffic the family against their will out of the country and to Brazil to hide them from the media. Just so much of this. So they bring in witnesses who testify. Janet Arvizo was excited. She told us, I can't wait to go to Brazil. And she was asking us, do you want to come with us? It's going to be an amazing trip. One of the most spectacular ways in which the conspiracy charge blew up in the prosecutors' faces was actually instigated by the prosecution. It was so bizarre. So Janet Arvizo has just come on the stand. I think it's her first day of testimony. And she testifies about the first time she escapes from the ranch. And she says, we were being held there against our will. We weren't allowed to leave. And under the cover of darkness, I found an employee there whose name was Jesus Salas. He's Hispanic like us. I said to him, can you help us? We need to get off of this ranch. And he agreed to sneak us off the ranch. He put us in a car and he drove us home, right? So then the prosecutor, Ron Zonen, says, at this moment, I would like to play the tape recording. Now, in the transcript, there is no transcript of the tape recording. So when you read a trial transcript, at the moment where a video or a tape is played, it just says, whereupon a portion of exhibit XYZ was played. And then it comes back to the testimony, right? I managed to gain access to this tape recording, to the exhibit that Ron Zonen had played. And so I listened to it. It's a tape recording which was made the following morning of a phone call between Michael's personal assistant, Frank Cassio, and Janet Arvizo. At this time, the Michael Jackson organization is documenting every interaction they have with the Arvizos because of the warning that they've received from Chris Tucker. So in the morning, Frank Cassio wakes up. The Arvizos have vanished from the ranch, and he rings Janet Arvizo at her home, and the recording, the call was tape recorded. So in this in this tape recording, which is less than 24 hours after she leaves the ranch, Frank says, I woke up this morning, you were gone, what happened? And Janet Arvizo says, oh, Frank, you're not going to believe this, right? I was on the ranch yesterday minding my own business, and the Germans came up to me, the Germans being Michael's managers, Dieter Weisner and Ronald Konitzer, and they said, Janet, you've been at the ranch long enough. The furore over this documentary has died down. Nobody's camping outside your house anymore. Your kids are missing school. You need to go back to your normal life. It's time for you to go home. And I said, how dare you? We can never go back to our normal life. You know, our life is over now because of this. We need to stay here. And they said, no, you know, you've been here for quite a while now. It's time for you to leave. You need to go home. And I was so furious that I went and found Jesus Salas and I said, if they want us off the ranch, then we'll leave. and then they're having this discussion, and Frank's like, oh, okay. And she's saying, and I was so looking forward to that trip to Brazil. And Frank says, well, you can still go to Brazil if you want. And they're having this whole conversation about, oh, it's going to be so wonderful. We can dance under the moonlight and do the salsa. And then she starts saying, these Germans, they're trying to come between me and Michael. They're trying to separate me from Michael. Michael is the father to my children now. Michael, we are a family now. His family is our family and our family is his family. And these Germans, they're just trying to come between us and they're trying to kick us off the ranch. And I'm listening to this tape, which is literally the exact opposite of what Janet had just testified to under oath. She's just testified I was being held against my will and I had to escape. And now we're listening to an unguarded, secretly recorded conversation with her less than 24 hours after it happened, where she says, I wanted to stay and they kicked me out, right? Why did Ron Zonen play? I've never understood why Ron Zonen played that tape. It's kind of mad. It's just a completely demented thing to do as a prosecutor. The only conclusion I can draw is that he knew it was bad and he knew the defense would play it. So he thought maybe if I play it, it will trick the jury into thinking it's good for the prosecution rather than bad. I don't know. But I mean, it was, in my opinion, it's one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in the whole trial, because this is not a bunch of defense witnesses coming in and testifying to impeach Janet Arvizo. This is Janet Arvizo impeaching Janet Arvizo. We are listening to Janet Arvizo in her own words at the time, telling the jury that what she's just testified to under oath was a lie, was not true. So this conspiracy charge just fell to pieces like a wet cake. It was a disaster. Almost every element of the conspiracy charge, from the we were being held against our will, we weren't allowed to look at clocks, we weren't allowed to speak to people on the phone, we weren't allowed to meet anyone, it all was positively proven to be not true. So what you're left with, and when I interviewed the jury foreman, whose name was Paul Rodriguez, he said that one thing that the jurors all agreed on when they got into their deliberations, they realized there was something they were all agreed on, which was before the defense had even begun their case. By the time the prosecution had finished their case, they were all sure, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the Arvizos were lying about the conspiracy. So what you're left with in that instance is some molestation charges for which the only evidence is the testimony of two witnesses who have lied to you about every other element of their story. So how can you possibly convict Michael Jackson based on the word of Gavin Arvizo and Star Arvizo when it has been proved to you beyond any reasonable doubt that this whole other story they've told you about being kidnapped and held hostage, and we weren't allowed to look at clocks and we weren't allowed to look and speak to anyone, it was all just fake. It was all just a lie. So,
but on those, I mean, I take that point, but I mean, on those molestation allegations, the testimony of the two accusers, or the two brothers, Gavin Arvizo, who is the alleged victim, and Star Arvizo, who is a witness to some of these acts, was also found to be questionable. Let's put it this way, right? Now, there are a couple of things that I remember. One is the grandma Michael Jackson masturbation story. Can you please tell me that? Because that sort of torched the case a bit. No, and not a bit. I mean, that torched the case from what I remember. Was it I don't know if it was as significant as I remember it being, but perhaps you can shed some light on that.
It was one of a number of significant moments of impeachment during the boys' testimony. So Gavin Arvizo tells the jury, Michael Jackson told me that you have to masturbate because if you don't, you can become so sexually pent up that you'll rape somebody. When Tom Mesereau was sat there listening to this testimony during direct examination, it rang a bell with him, and he started looking through the paperwork. And he realized that when Gavin was interviewed by the police had asked him various questions about does he know what sex is and does he know what masturbation is. And he tells the police, I know what masturbation is because my grandmother told me. She told me that if I didn't masturbate, I could become so sexually pent up that I would rape somebody. So he seems in his courtroom evidence to have transposed the words of his grandmother into the mouth of Michael Jackson. But also, there was
But yeah, well, I
there
mean,
was
it's stunning. It's stunningly unlikely that they would say the exact same thing. You know, especially something as far fetched as this. I mean,
yeah, and it's covered in the Netflix show, and Diane Dimond sort of tries to make out like this is some kind of chicanery by the defense, and like, well, clearly Michael Jackson and the grandmother both said it, but I mean, that's just so
yeah,
unlikely,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know.
yeah,
But
yeah.
there were a lot of problems. So, for example, in the original version of the story, Gavin told the police he'd been molested 5 or 6 times. By the time it comes to court, he's saying it's 1 or 2 times. When I interviewed the jury foreman, Paul Rodriguez, he said that caused the jury quite a substantial problem because they were like, firstly, what kind of kid doesn't know the difference between being molested 1 and 6 times? And even when you're saying 1 or 2 times, I mean, you would know if it happened more than once, right? So he found that discrediting. There was the fact that the brother, who was supposedly an eyewitness, had wildly changed his story about what he actually saw. So he had, on one occasion, described seeing Michael Jackson and his brother laying in a spoon's position with Michael kind of rubbing against his brother. And then by the time he comes to court, they're lying side by side with Michael's hand in the boy's underwear. Also, the story had changed as to whether his brother was wearing pajamas or underwear. That had changed. So there were quite substantial inconsistencies in the accounts. But also, when I spoke to Paul Rodriguez, he said, what you get from the transcript is the words, but what you don't get from the transcript is the body language. So Paul Rodriguez was a retired school counselor, and he said to me, I know when a kid is lying to me, and I could see it. And also, he said, what you didn't get from the transcript was Mesereau had a very clever way of questioning the boys in particular. So the way he explained it to me was, he said, when people learn a story, they tend to learn the story from start to finish. And so if you question somebody out of order, it becomes very difficult for them to keep track of the story they're supposed to be telling. He said, if you live through something, it's not a problem. If you genuinely experience something, people can ask you all sorts of questions about it, and you can just answer them. But if you're trying to memorize a story, it becomes very difficult if you break it up. So when he was cross-examining both of the boys, he kept jumping backwards and forwards in the chronology to different parts of the story. And they started to completely lose the plot. So by the time Star Arvizo had finished his testimony, he was back to the version of the story that Michael was originally indicted on, where the molestation happened on the earlier dates, for which Michael had an alibi. So by the time he'd finished his testimony, he had regressed back to the first version of the story, which was the story that was demonstrably not true. But Paul Rodriguez said it was the way that the witnesses were looking at the prosecution in an almost pleading way. Like Tom Mesereau would be asking them questions, and they would be looking at the prosecutors as if to say, what am I supposed to say? I can't remember what I'm supposed to say. So you only get so much from a transcript, and that's what a jury is there for. I sit in court every week, and when you sit in a trial, the judge will tell the jury, sometimes they'll say, don't take too many notes, because this case is about what the witnesses say, but it's also about how they say it. You are here as a jury to bring your collective common sense and world experience to the case, and you need to be looking at these witnesses and assessing whether you believe they're telling you the truth. And that was what Paul Rodriguez said. He said, from the transcript, you get all the discrepancies, but from being in court, you got the body language. And that was what persuaded him that these complainants were not credible.
Of course, Gavin Arvizo also, if I'm not wrong, says that, well, he was questioned about an interview he'd had with, I suppose, the headmaster or the principal of his school, to whom he'd said that no molestation had happened. That also happened, am I right?
That was Jeffrey Alpert. Yeah, and by the way, the lady who said that Janet rang her and said, if you want to contact me, go through my attorney, Larry Feldman, that was Mary Holzer. I've just remembered her name. So Jeffrey Alpert and Mary Holzer were two witnesses who came forward after the trial had already started. They saw the trial on the news and were like, hang on a minute, I know something about this. So Jeffrey Alpert, he was a teacher at the Hollywood High School, which is right near the Walk of Fame and opposite Mel's Drive-In, I think it's called. So he recalled vividly having a discussion with Gavin Arvizo and with his mother, where he said, look, did anything happen to you? Because he was getting picked on in school about the Bashir documentary. And he was like, look, did anything happen? Gavin was like, no, it didn't. Then he spoke to Janet, and he said Janet was absolutely rhapsodizing about Michael is just amazing. You know, he's looked after us. Nothing inappropriate has ever happened. And he was able to peg it to spring break. He said, obviously, I didn't take a contemporaneous note of exactly what date this happened on, but I remember it happened, and he gave a proximity to spring break. And essentially, it was possible to determine from the date that he gave that this all happened after they had left the ranch for the last time. So it's after the alleged, this is another instance of the conspiracy charge falling apart. So this whole discussion with Jeffrey Alpert happens after Janet is now saying she'd been held against her will at the ranch, she'd been prevented from talking to people, she'd not been allowed to talk to anyone. But here she is telling the school teacher, Michael is wonderful, he's been great to us, you know, we're great friends with him. So that was another knife in the heart of the conspiracy charge, as well as the molestation.
Yeah, okay. So towards the end of this case, the prosecution tries to get permission to introduce something called prior bad acts evidence. Can you tell me a little bit about that, please, Charles?
Yeah, so that was actually precedent setting. So there had been for a while in California at that time a statute called 1108, which allowed you in these kind of cases to bring in evidence of uncharged prior similar allegations. However, what the judge did in this case had never ever been done before, which was that he allowed prior bad acts evidence to be brought in without the alleged victims testifying. So it brought in effectively a parade of paid tabloid informants who had received large amounts of money to come up with stories about Michael Jackson and kids, to repeat the stories that they'd sold to the media. But they were stories about kids who themselves were saying, I was never molested, this didn't happen. So that was unprecedented in California. It never ever happened before. So it was one of many examples of the judge basically throwing a life raft to the prosecution to try to bolster their case for them. But ultimately, it was a disaster. So it's one of those things. I was watching the Netflix documentary, and on several occasions, Diane Diamond says things like, but then what the prosecution did then, I thought was brilliant. Every time she said that, I just thought, well, it wasn't that brilliant, Diane, was it? Because they lost the case. So anyway, so they bring in these 1108 witnesses, and it was just a train wreck. It was an absolute train wreck because every single one of them had such catastrophic credibility issues. So with many of them, they had actually been asked, did you ever see anything inappropriate with Michael Jackson and kids? And they said no. But then somebody would knock on the door and say, I've got $10,000, $20,000, $50,000 for you if you're prepared to say you saw Michael Jackson doing something inappropriate with a kid. And all of a sudden they changed their story. And what became clear was that there were certain media organizations that were effectively working in tandem with the prosecution. It was almost like a a pincer movement. So the media would show up, a particular media organization would show up. They would offer money and say, if you're prepared to say you saw this, that, or the other, we'll give you 20,000, 50,000, whatever it was. Enormous sums were being offered. One family was offered 200,000 to say something. As soon as they said it, the story would come out in the paper or on TV, and immediately the police or the prosecutors would be on the doorstep saying, we've seen this story that you sold. And what they would do, it's so clever and so subtle, but they would sit down with their tape recorder and say, right, so just so you know, if this does come to court, all of this will have to be given to Michael Jackson in disclosure, because he will have a right to see it. His defense will have a right to see it. But anyway, so were you telling the truth to the media, or were you maliciously defaming Michael Jackson? So basically, it's like you're putting them between a rock and a hard place. Even if they have an attack of conscience, they can't now say, no, it was all lies. Because if they say it's all lies, this tape is going to be given to Michael Jackson's defense lawyer. And now he can sue the crap out of them, right? So it becomes a situation where they are effectively press ganged into becoming a prosecution witness. The media shows up and gives them the bag of cash, and then the prosecutors knock on the door and say, it'd be a terrible shame if we had to tell Michael Jackson that you admit to lying about this, wouldn't it? So they were effectively press ganged into becoming witnesses. And there were, for example, Blanca Francia, she ended up completely recanting on the stand. So she claimed that she'd seen Michael Jackson in the shower with a kid. And by the time she finished her evidence, after being cross-examined by Tom Mesereau, she was admitting that she never saw Michael Jackson in the shower with a kid. So she actually did recant. But others, one of them was...
Wait, hang on. Her son took to the stand during that case and said that he had been molested. Please do tell me about that. It forms a significant part of the Netflix documentary.
Yes, so Jason Francia, so I talked to you last time about the very aggressive way in which that the police officers were approaching children and telling them lies and shouting and swearing at them and saying, you're a liar, just admit that you were molested. Jason Francia was one of those kids. They showed up at his school and interviewed him in the absence of his mother or a lawyer. And they basically harassed him in a very aggressive way. This is according to Jason Francia himself. He said in a deposition or a statement, they kept making me come up with stuff that got to the point where I wanted to hit them in the head. He insists for a very long time, Michael Jackson never did anything inappropriate with me. He tells them he was very encouraging with my schoolwork. He would get me to read books. If I read a book and I was able to talk to him about the book, he would give me $10 or something. He was really kind to me. We would used to watch cartoons, and sometimes we would have a tickle contest. As the police just keep saying to him, "You're lying." They were swearing at him. They were shouting at him. They were saying, "You're lying." Then they were saying, he's molesting Macaulay Culkin right now. As we speak, he's molesting Macaulay Culkin, and it's your fault. If you don't tell us what he did to you, we can't save Macaulay Culkin, right? All this stuff. Eventually, he comes up with an account where he says, well, maybe a couple of times during the tickle contests, he might have brushed against my groin outside my clothing, right? That's the story that he comes up with at that point. Then his mother firstly sells a story to Hard Copy for $20,000, but then goes for a meeting with Larry Feldman. And after she goes for a meeting with Larry Feldman, now the son is saying, rather than saying Michael Jackson used to get me to read books, and if I read a book, he'd give me some money, he's now saying he used to grab me on the crotch, and then if I didn't say anything, he would stuff money down my underwear and all this kind of stuff, right? So, but what does this lead to? It leads to a $2 million payout from Michael Jackson's defense lawyers at the same time as or roughly the same time as the Chandler payout. So it's highly dubious, and is ultimately linked to a demand for millions of dollars.
But a successful demand in this case, right? And so if these people are lying, I mean, I think we discussed this maybe briefly last time, that the settlements actually do enable more of these sorts of allegations to come through. They open a Pandora's box.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. But Michael is, as I say, he's in the situation he's in, whereby he's looking down the barrel of these people coming to a civil trial and him having to give his defense away in the civil trial before he can face any kind of criminal proceedings. So the settlements, although retrospectively you can look back and go, they were a bad decision, and ultimately they incentivized people to come forward with more allegations. They did have a sound legal basis at the time. There was a rational legal basis on which to pay those settlements.
We've talked about the Netflix documentary. I am hoping to speak to Aphrodite Jones next week about sort of the media reaction to the trial, the atmosphere at the time, and also why there is like sort of a guilter movement in the media that sort of far outstrips the proportion of the public that believes Michael Jackson was guilty. I mean, the latest polling shows that only about sort of 19% of people believe that Michael Jackson was guilty of any of these crimes, right? Which is the lowest, which is the minority opinion. So more people believe that he was absolutely innocent, and then more people than that are unwilling to say, as in they just don't know. So we're hoping to speak to Aphrodite Jones about why that might be the case. But I do want to speak to you a little bit about the Netflix documentary, which I gather you've seen. There are a number of eye-catching claims in that documentary, Charles, and I'm just going to go through them one by one. I just want you to react to them. So, according to Diane Diamond, and I don't know that much about her personally, so perhaps you'll enlighten me. Just before a search warrant was executed for Neverland, Michael Jackson was holed up in a villa in Vegas having wild parties with teenage boys who only spoke German. That's one of the claims that comes out of the documentary. Do you know anything about that?
I know that Diane has said it. I've seen no evidence to substantiate it ever. I've never heard a single independent witness corroborate it. I've never seen any evidence of it at all. So if Diane would like to place into the public domain her actual evidence for that assertion, then great. But until she does that, it's an assertion.
Okay. Next one. So in the doc, the accuser, Gavin Arvizo, is shown saying, and this is the sheriff's footage of his interview, his testimony. So he says Michael Jackson showed him and his little brother pornography, which he kept in a black suitcase, black briefcase, maybe it was. And in the documentary, the prosecutor, Ron Zonen, says that when they executed the search warrant on Neverland, this suitcase was found, which corroborates Gavin's story.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me about that, because that pissed me off when I watched it. So, so firstly, in the documentary, Ron Zonen says that the allegation was that Michael Jackson would use the pornography to stimulate victims for abuse. That is absolutely not what the Arvizos said at all. So the two Arvizo brothers come to court and they both give wildly conflicting stories about this supposed briefcase of pornography. I forget which one is which, right? But one of them says, we walked into the room and it was there, and Michael looked irritated to see it and said, Frank Cassio must have been in my room again, picked it up and took it away.
The briefcase?
Other ones, the briefcase, yeah.
Okay, one of the brothers says that Michael was annoyed that the briefcase was there, and okay, right, got it.
Yeah. The other one says they walked into the room and it was there, Michael sat on the bed and looked through it for a couple of minutes and then put it away, right? Neither of them says he used it to stimulate them for abuse. That is a claim by Ron Zonen, which has absolutely no factual basis at all. However, firstly, both of the brothers' stories about this conflict. Secondly, they are shown to be lying about vast swathes of the rest of their story. what the defense does is it calls a litany of witnesses to testify to various pieces of information which add up to a completely different explanation. So they called witnesses who said that the Arvizos were essentially like thieves who would just go into people's houses and root around and steal things. So there was an actress, I think her name was Vernee Watson Johnson. She said they came to my house. They absolutely tore through my house like a tornado. They had no respect for my privacy. They went through all my drawers and everything, and I never let them in my house again. There was a dentist who said they did the same thing in my office, and they actually ended up rendering unusable a bunch of sterile equipment that I had to throw away because they were going through all my stuff. There were witnesses who said that they saw the brothers going through Neverland and stealing things. So there was another child who came and gave evidence and said that they saw the Arvizo brothers going to Michael Jackson's office. And in his office, he had a paperweight with something like $100 note in it. And they smashed the paperweight and stole the note. There were witnesses, child witnesses, who said that they saw the Arvizos running through the house and stealing wine out of the kitchen refrigerator. And there were a number of witnesses who said they saw the Arvizo boys going into Michael Jackson's bedroom when he was not on the property, and including staff members who told them, don't go in there when he's not here, and they just ignored them and went in anyway. There were other witnesses who testified that on occasions when Michael Jackson was not on the ranch, they saw the Arvizo boys walking around the property carrying pornographic magazines. And there was one guy who actually testified that Star Arvizo left one of the magazines on one of the amusement rides that he'd been on. So what this all added up to, essentially, was quite a large number of unimpeached defense witnesses whose stories taken together suggested that the more likely explanation for the boys knowing about the pornography being in Michael's room was that they had been going into his room without permission, in defiance of explicit instructions not to, when he was not there, rooting through his room and had found it independently, and had then been seen carrying the contents of the briefcase around the ranch when Michael Jackson wasn't even there. And in fact, there was a moment in Star Arvizo's own testimony where he slipped up because he said something about, I forget what the context was now, but he said something about...
No, I remember. I think I know what you're referring to. I think Tom Mesereau, the defense counsel for Michael Jackson, showed him a magazine, a porn magazine, and asked him if that porn magazine was the one that, in fact, Michael Jackson had showed him to groom him. Star Arvizo said, yes, that's the one. And it turned out that the date on it was August. So it was long after they had left Neverland Ranch. In other words, they couldn't possibly have been shown that magazine because it wasn't in circulation. It hadn't been printed at the time.
That did happen, but it's not what I was going to say. So
okay.
There was a moment in his cross-examination where he said something about blah 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 in the drawer where Michael keeps all of his spare razor blades for shaving his face. And Tom Mesereau said to him, "How do you know where Michael Jackson keeps his spare razor blades?" And he went, he showed me. I was like, well, why would he show you that? Yeah. So it was clear that they had been going through his drawers in his room. So there was so essentially what you have two boys, right, who are saying, the two Arvizo boys who are saying Michael showed us pornography from this briefcase. They are uncorroborated by any other witnesses, and vast swathes of the rest of their story has been shown to be lies. Or, on the other hand, you have this whole collection of defense witnesses whose unimpeached testimony adds up to a more plausible explanation that the boys had been rooting around his room and found it themselves. So no juror who was taking their oath seriously could possibly have come down on the boys' side on that story. But also, there's one other thing. So there was a witness called Carol Lemire. She was never called. Because Tom Mesereau ended his case early, she ended up never being called. But she actually, she had warned Michael Jackson's assistant in around 2001 to get him away from the Arvizos, because she was the, as I say, she was the lady who introduced the Arvizos to Michael, because her grandson was in the same tap dancing class, and she was so close to the family that she told the investigators that Devlin Arvizo used to live in her house because she didn't get on with Janet. By the way, the only reason we know all this is because Carol Lemire's witness statements were attached to a motion. They were appendices to a motion to introduce something into the case, because she never ended up testifying, but her witness statements are on the court record. So she said that Devlin Arvizo basically described Janet Arvizo as a basket case. He would force her to go stealing. She was crazy, and sometimes Devlin Arvizo would be woken up in the night by Janet just beating her in her sleep for no reason.
This is the daughter.
This is
Janet
daughter,
Arvizo's daughter.
Gavin and Starr's sister. And
Yeah.
she testified that there was one moment where Devlin was in her house, and she said something about, "Oh, I might not be seeing you so much soon because Mum says we're all going to be moving to a house in the Hollywood Hills." And Carol Lemire is like, "What? How's that going to happen?" And she says, "Well, Michael's going to pay for it." And Carol Lemire is like, "Well, Michael is generous, but a house in the hills, a house in the Hollywood Hills, but that's crazy. That's what are you talking about?" And Devlin, this is according to the witness statement, Devlin said, "My mum is planning to falsely accuse Michael of showing pornography to my brothers, and she's going to use the money that she makes out of that to buy us a house in the Hollywood Hills." So Carol Lemire says, "Oh, that's outrageous. Like, what are you talking about? How can you do that? That's an evil thing to do." And then Devlin says, "Oh, it's only a joke. I'm only joking. I didn't mean it."
Okay.
And so Carol Lemire rings Michael's personal assistant, Evie Tavassi, and says, "You need to get him away from this family right now. You need to separate him from this family." And that is the point at which Michael's contact with the Arvizos is severed, and they start sending all these cards and letters about, "We miss you, Daddy, where we miss our brother and sister, Prince in Paris, you're our father, blah, blah, blah." It's unclear, because Michael never testified, whether he knew, but it seems likely that he didn't, because otherwise, why would he invite them back for the Bashir thing? So it seems like Michael's staff basically iced the family out. And then when Bashir came calling, Michael unwittingly invited them back into his life. But so, of course, that ties into the whole pornography thing as well, basically.
Just on the pornography bit, this is something that I've heard and I've read about. I wanted to ask you whether it's true. Is it true that some have accused the prosecutor, Tom Sneddon, of allowing the boys to put their fingerprints on magazines during their depositions? In other words, to show that these magazines had been handled by them when the trial actually started, these porn magazines. Do you know if that's true?
It's potentially true. So it was never definitively showed, but what they were able to demonstrate was that in the grand jury, the boys had been handed magazines to look at, and there was no discussion.
Magazine seized from Neverland Ranch.
Yes, yeah, and there was no discussion in the transcript about gloves. So ordinarily, when a witness handles an exhibit in court, they would be asked to put gloves on. And a witness would not know to just put gloves on because they've never been in court before. So ordinarily, somebody in the transcript would be saying, "If you just put those gloves on, then we'll hand you the exhibit," right? But there's nothing in the transcript at all about gloves. So it was never definitively shown. They actually questioned some of the grand jurors, and they all just said, "We don't remember." But it seems likely that they did handle the magazines without gloves on because there's nothing in the grand jury transcripts about gloves.
So if true, that's either negligent, in which case you'd have to believe that a very, very senior lawyer and prosecutor, one who'd been in post for more than 20 years, if I'm not mistaken, suddenly makes a mistake, after all his experience and all his years of service, or it's potentially criminal, but we'll never know, I guess.
Well, what we do know is Tom Sneddon did have a long history of deliberately framing innocent people, and that's not something we really have time to go into here. But I have done huge amounts of research into his department, and there have been case after case after case where courts have determined that there was very serious misconduct on the part of Tom Sneddon and his department, which amounted to either the suppression of evidence of somebody's innocence or the manufacturing of evidence to wrongly convict them. So he was somebody who was prepared to play outside the rules, generally speaking.
Okay. So then the last case, I beg your pardon, the last claim that's worth examining, and this is perhaps the most salacious of the new claims about Michael Jackson from the documentary, is the one made by Michael Jackson's former publicist, Vince Amon. Now, Amon says that sometime after Michael Jackson was charged, so I guess that would be around 2004, Michael Jackson's personal assistant, Frank Tyson, gave him a Nike bag, which had a magazine inside it. And the magazine contained a video catalog section in which Michael Jackson had allegedly encircled videos he wanted Frank Tyson to order for him. And these videos were of naked boys. What do you know about that? So apparently, when questioned about it by Vince Amon, Frank Tyson said, "This is a phase that Michael and I went through. We used to watch these videos. He'd ask me to order these videos, and we'd watch them together." So this is the claim from the documentary that has gotten the most traction. It's the most explosive claim, and just from experience, when people talk about it, just casual viewers, when they talk about the documentary, this is the bit that they latch onto.
Well, it's difficult to talk about because it's new information, which is essentially coming only from Vince Amon. And so we have not independently seen any evidence of this. What is peculiar about it is that Vincent Amon is claiming that this evidence came into his possession in around early 2004. What I know about Vince Amon is that he was very vocally and publicly advocating for Michael Jackson's innocence as recently as the year 2020. So in around 2013, he contributed an article to a pro-Michael Jackson book, and he wrote in that article that he knew that Michael Jackson had been falsely accused, and that through his experience and involvement in this case, he came to understand the burden that Michael had shouldered in being falsely accused in front of the world. He became quite vocal on Twitter at one point. He was very vocal about Michael Jackson's innocence during the Leaving Neverland period. In 2020, when the film Square One was released, he publicly promoted that and said again, Janet Arvizo was a false accuser, Michael Jackson was innocent, and this documentary is great, everybody should watch it. I am in touch with a researcher who was communicating with Vince Amon more recently than that even, and at that time all he had to say was positive stuff. But now all of a sudden, 20 years later, he is claiming that he had evidence in 2004 to show that Michael Jackson was guilty. There is a big discrepancy there, which is completely unexplained, and it is a dereliction of duty of Netflix, of Channel 4, who have also included him in their version of this show, of The Sun, which has run an interview with him, of Piers Morgan, for example, who had Vince Amon on his show recently. It's a dereliction of duty of all of these journalists who are treating Vince Amon with credulity and neither highlighting this inconsistency nor asking him about it. So if you genuinely had evidence in 2004, which you now say proves Michael Jackson guilty, and you knew from 2004 that Michael Jackson was guilty, why on earth did you spend the next 20 years publicly advocating for his innocence? It doesn't make any sense. So he was asked,
and actually,
Morgan,
Charles, I mean, in the documentary, he refers to it as a turning point. The moment the moment when he's handed this Nike bag by Frank Tyson is a turning point for me. That's what he says. This is the moment where I decide that actually something's going on. This is a turning point for me. I mean, turning point, and I guess what you're saying is for 20 years, this turning point didn't really turn much.
I hesitate slightly to go in too much on Frank Amon because Vince Amon because I wonder whether he's okay, if I can put it that way. His behavior on Twitter is sometimes quite erratic and quite manic. It doesn't often make a lot of sense. The things that he writes don't make a lot of sense. He has a website on which he seems to me to be trying to draw some kind of link between Michael Jackson and, like this Middle Eastern governments and the German military. And there's this whole conspiracy that he seems to believe has occurred, which to me does not make sense and would not make sense to anybody of right mind. So, there is a massive discrepancy between what Vince was saying up until a couple of years ago and what he's saying now. That discrepancy is not explained. I hope he's okay.
Okay, yeah, sure. Okay, then. So then, just to finish off, the first question I guess I should ask is there anything else that's worth mentioning here, or have we covered most of it? Is there anything else that comes to mind?
When we're talking about the Netflix documentary, I think there's a few things that I found egregious. One is the presentation of Louise Palanca, which Channel 4 also did. Channel 4 and Netflix have basically made near identical series about this case, which have come out on top of each other, featuring largely the same people telling the same stories. Louise Palanca is in both of them. There is no mention in either of these documentaries about the fact that Louise Palanca was a witness in this case. She was a prosecution witness, and her cross-examination by Tom Mesereau was, in my opinion, one of the most devastating, embarrassing cross-examinations of the whole trial. I don't have time to go into it now, but she left the stand in that case not looking good. And to platform her in these documentaries without highlighting the catastrophic damage that was inflicted on the credibility of her story by the cross-examination by Tom Mesereau, in my opinion, is ethically indefensible. Nor, the fact that they don't mention that she was actually in a relationship with one of the prosecutors, which is quite significantly important. And there's no mention, for example, of Chris Tucker. Chris Tucker was a seismically important witness he was effectively the defense's last witness. I think after he finished his testimony, they called a couple of witnesses to the stand very briefly as kind of mop-up witnesses, and then Tom Mesereau ended his case. And it was because Chris Tucker's testimony was so catastrophically damaging to both the Arvizos and Tom Sneddon, and the prosecution generally. So Chris Tucker testifies basically that he met Michael Jackson through Gavin Arvizo, and they became friends. And he talks about how the Arvizos were a terrible liability. They were constantly hitting him up for money. They would abuse his hospitality. There was one time he flew them out to a movie set. They were completely poorly behaved. They disrupted the filming. They cost money to the production. They then refused to leave the hotel and basically ran up a massive bill that he was paying for. And then he testifies about how after the Bashir documentary airs, the Arvizos contact him and say, this is a disaster. We're all over the TV. The press are trying to get in touch with us. We're being hounded. Michael's in Florida. We need to get to Florida. And Chris says, well, I'm going to Florida anyway. And they say, well, can you take us on your jet? And so he does, right? He takes them to Florida with him, which again that's also a massive nail in the conspiracy charge, because one of the overt acts of conspiracy is that Michael Jackson has the Arvizos transported to Florida, which is, again, is that a crime, buying someone an air ticket? No, it's not. But if you're Michael Jackson and you're charged with conspiracy and you buy someone an airline ticket, you're going to prison, right? But anyway, it was actually Chris Tucker that flew them to Florida. And he says in his testimony that they were behaving really, really strangely. The mother was in histrionics, was shouting and screaming and crying about Michael is the father of my children, and you're the brother of my children, you're our family, we love you so much. And then the kids are like, oh, we don't have a car, our car is broken down. You have lots of money, Chris. In fact, you've got multiple cars. You could probably just give us one of your cars and you wouldn't even notice you didn't have it. And then they start asking him for a specific truck. They're saying, there's a particular truck you have. You could just give us that truck. You wouldn't miss it. You're rich anyway. So he's feeling very uncomfortable about this family. So he gets to Florida, delivers the family, brings them to the resort where Michael is staying. And then he goes into a room with Michael and he says, Michael, there's something seriously, seriously wrong with this family. You have got to get rid of them. They are nuts. They've spent the whole time I'm with them asking me for money, asking me for a truck. The woman is going berserk, like some kind of, religious fervor, and saying about, I'm the brother, you're the father, blah, blah, blah. And anyway, so that's his testimony. He is then cross-examined by Tom Sneddon. Tom Sneddon, again, like I said, he has had numerous rulings against him by courts that he and his department have engaged in very serious misconduct. He has also been dogged for years by allegations of racial targeting of people, the abuse of his office to target people for racial reasons. He is cross-examining Chris Tucker, and he shows Chris Tucker a photograph of himself and Michael. And Chris Tucker just kind of jokes, he says, that's quite a nice picture. Maybe, do you know where I can get a copy? And Tom Sneddon says, if you're a good boy. And apparently, from multiple people I've spoken to who were in court, this moment, this white prosecutor telling Chris Tucker that if he's a good boy, he'll give him a photo, just sucked all of the air out of the room. It was awful, and Sneddon just kind of stood there for a minute, and maybe he was thinking to himself, I shouldn't have said that, maybe I should apologize or whatever, but there was just this horrible, ugly silence that hung over the courtroom. And then he just carried on with his examination as if nothing had happened. And Tom Mesereau said that by the end of Chris Tucker's testimony, the combination of how devastating his evidence had been for the credibility of the Arvizos and this incredibly ugly moment where the prosecutor had made this racially loaded comment and just let it hang in the air, he said that the atmosphere in the courtroom towards the prosecution was so sour and ugly that he felt he would never get a moment like that again if this trial continued. So he had a month's worth of witnesses still on the bench ready to be called, including Carol Lemire, and he just took a decision in that moment and said, this is it, this is the moment, and he rested his case. And of course, it was the right decision because he got unanimous acquittals on every charge. But that moment in the trial was so important, particularly because so many people felt that Sneddon's obsession with Michael Jackson was in some way racially motivated. And to leave that out, when you're supposed to be making a serious documentary about this trial, and you leave out that the prosecutor of this African-American defendant made this comment to the African-American witness, you just don't mention it. You just cover it up. I mean, that's egregious. That's really egregious. It was so important that it actually cause the defense attorney to end his case, because he said to me when I interviewed him, I felt that at that moment that jury was ready to acquit, and if I kept them there any longer, if I carried on calling witnesses, they would actually start to hold it against me, because it would be like I was just detaining them from returning to their lives, and they might actually punish me for it. So that, I mean, it was seismic. Chris Tucker's testimony was absolutely seismic, and to just ignore it and not mention that it happened is so outrageous, really. I just thought that was a terrible, terrible omission, and a dishonest, is actively dishonest, in my opinion, for both Channel 4 and Netflix to omit it, because it really was vitally important to the outcome of the trial.
Understood. Well, that's, I think, as good a place as any to end this show. Charles, thanks for your time. Thanks for the several hours you've given us just to sort of unpick the truth. We'll be in touch if there's any more to talk about in the future. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.